Hi, and welcome to Second Chapter Careers, the podcast where we explore big, bold career changes and the stories behind them. I'm your host, Sari Holtz, a certified career coach who's navigated a few career pivots of my own. I've made it my mission to help others find work that truly fits, not just something that pays the bills. Each week, I talk to people who've reinvented themselves professionally, sometimes out of passion, sometimes out of necessity. And we dive into how they did it, what they learned, and what advice they'd give to others thinking about their own next chapter. It was a true honor to host today's guest, Rabbi Anthony Manning. The first in his family to go to university, Rabbi Manning studied at Oxford, worked as a solicitor at top firms in London, and was what most people would call successful. But deep down, he felt something was missing, something bigger than promotions or prestige. So he did the unthinkable. He walked away from billable hours, from big clients, from the traditional definition of success, and he started all over. Despite his limited Jewish education, Rabbi Manning moved to Israel, immersed himself in Jewish learning, and became a rabbi with 3 different smichas. Today, he's not only a teacher, he's shaping the future of Jewish generations as the head of a girls' seminary in Jerusalem and the author of a book about modesty. This episode is about ambition, values, faith, and the power of starting over, even when it doesn't make sense on paper. Let's jump right in. Hi, Rabbi Manning. Thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, Sarah. Nice to see you.
Thanks. Okay, let's just jump right into it. Can you give us, please, a brief overview of your early education and life, how you got started in your career, let's say?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in the north of England in a small-ish town called Leeds. It's an industrial town. It has a nice Jewish community. It's actually the 3rd biggest Jewish community in England, but it's still very small. It's about 7,000 or 8,000 people, which by American standards is tiny. But it was a very friendly, supportive community. My parents and grandparents were all born there. My great-grandparents came over there from Eastern Europe. And I grew up in a home which was really, in terms of my Jewish upbringing, it was an Orthodox affiliated home, but it was not a practicing halachically observant home. And therefore we went to shul a lot, and we synagogue, and we were very connected with that community, but we always drove there, and we were never really connected in terms of the halachic observance. That's the kind of. I went to a non-Jewish elementary school. I went to a Jewish day school for 4th and 5th grade, I suppose it would be. And then after that, I went to the non-Jewish private, very preppy school, which was all boys. It was called Leeds Grammar School. My parents are from a very kind of working sort of middle class background. They didn't stay in school and high school beyond the age of 16. They didn't go to university. I was the first member of my family that ever was still in high school after the age of 16. Wow. Everyone else was my grandfather was a tailor, my father was in retail, my mother worked in a shop and different things. And I'm an only child, so all the focus was on me. My parents were clearly very concerned that I should have a good education. They actually took me to Jewish Hebrew school from a very young age, 3 times a week, from about 5 or 6. And therefore I did have quite a decent background and foundational Jewish education there. But once they found out they could get me into this preppy private school with a decent scholarship, so then I went, and I was there really from 6th grade, 5th grade, all the way through till the end, and did really very well there. It was a very high energy, high pressure school, very grades oriented, but it was a fantastic education. I really enjoyed it enormously. And did well there. It was a very kind of Hogwarts type hierarchical school. They had all the things that you think that they made up on, Harry Potter is not true. They were based on the British school system. We were about 500-600 boys. We were divided into 4 houses. There was a headmaster that spoke to us from a lectern. There were houses with points on and points off. These were all real things. There were prefects. There was a head boy. And to cut a long story short, I ended up being a prefect of the school and being a head boy, which was pretty unprecedented for a Jewish kid. It was the school was founded in 1552, so it was a very old Church of England school. But we had about 150 Jewish boys there, but they'd never had a Jewish boy who was the head boy for a long, long, long time. They'd only ever had one previously about 30 years before. So that was a big thing. There was reasons why they chose me, which I'm not getting into now. It's more to do with the previous head boy disgracing himself. But rather than picking the head of the rugby team, a 6'3" head of the rugby team, they picked a small, slightly podgy Jewish violin player that was me and decided to see how that would go. And for me, it was amazing. So it really pushed me to the top of the school, and I worked very hard. And by the end of my school career, they were funneling me towards Oxford University, which is we're probably going to get onto. But so I had an excellent high school education. I didn't have much of a high school level Jewish education. I had a decent bar mitzvah, and I read the whole parsha, etc., as was expected. But there was an imbalance, clearly, in my education by the age of 18, which I didn't feel at the time, but I did feel later.
Okay, so that's a really deep history. Tell me, okay, so after high school, did you go straight to Oxford?
Yes, so my school was very into getting kids into Oxford and Cambridge. It looked good for the school, and it was usually good for the kids. In the English school system, it's very different to the American school system. For 11th and 12th grade, you focus, certainly in those days, and still to some degree, you focus on only 2 or 3 subjects. And you drop everything else. So I focused for 11th and 12th grade on English literature, French literature, and German literature, which I was advised not to do because there was too much literature, but I did anyway because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to do biology, but they wouldn't let me because it didn't fit with the whatever. So I did those, and then they said, okay, so you should go to Oxford and study modern languages. French and German were my things. I actually spent a little bit of time even in high school in Germany, in Hanover, did a school exchange, and spoke pretty good German at the time, so they were pushing me towards Oxford. Now, a certain time before the actual entry exam, the school said to me, actually, we've changed our mind. We think you might be good at law as an undergraduate study. I'd never even considered, honestly, being a lawyer. I had no pressure from my parents to be anything specific other than to do the best that I could, and they helped me in every way and supported me, but they had no expectations of me. Honestly, by the time I got to 17, I was still at school. I'd already exceeded, past, expectations. So, but they were very supportive of me doing the best I could, and the school told me to do law. Now, in England, law undergraduate is a very popular degree, even for people who don't become lawyers. It's a very broadening degree. It helps you think. So a lot of people who do law undergrad don't become lawyers. I said, okay, so I'll do law undergraduate. It didn't really make much difference to me at the time. I was a pretty easygoing kid. I was bright. I got good grades. I didn't argue much. I didn't have a preset idea as to what I wanted to be. I didn't grow up wanting to be a fireman or a policeman or a spaceman or anything like that. Didn't really give it that much thought. They had a very primitive computer program at the time, which is 1986, which you could program in data, and it said what you should be. I think it said I should be a librarian or something like that because I like books, but I wasn't particularly interested in that. So although I have a lot of books now, which is great, so I went to Oxford. I applied. You applied in those days in the middle of your 12th grade. I got in, and that takes all the pressure off your exams. Once you got into Oxford in those days, then you're in basically. As long as you pass with any grade, it was fine. And that I ended up on that track almost just sort of automatically. I was perfectly happy with it, but I didn't really know why I wanted to do it specifically. I imagine
Sounds like a lot of college students, a lot of pre-college students these days, I guess you could say, don't really have a plan.
Yeah, I'd like to think that my teachers saw in me the potential to be happy as a lawyer and thought that would be good for me, as opposed to just it would be easier to get me into Oxford and therefore the school would get another person into Oxford in that way. I'd never really discussed it with them, but I liked my teachers a lot and I had a close relationship with them, so I'd like to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they thought it would be good for me.
And did you enjoy the study of law? Did you end up practicing law?
Yes, so yes and yes. Law undergraduate in Oxford. In Oxford, you go to a college in Oxford. It's not just Oxford University. You're a member of a specific college. You apply to that college. It's a little bit random where you apply. I applied to a college called St. Anne's because the school said, again, my school said to do that. I married my wife. Her grandfather was at Cambridge. There was a whole family tradition of Oxford and Cambridge. I was just like, yeah, whatever. I mean, I'll go wherever you think is best. You get your lessons, as it were, your studying goes across different colleges anyway, so it doesn't really matter much where you went in the first place. I enjoyed it a lot. I didn't do an awful lot of work on my law studies in my early days at Oxford. The way it worked then is very strange. Again, for Americans, this will seem very strange. There was no coursework. There were no credits. You did exams in March of your first year to prove that you were capable of being there. They were important exams, and I worked for those. And then the next exam was in May of your third year.
Wow.
And there was nothing in between, other than a very basic thing to show you were still alive and you were still there in the college and you just hadn't disappeared. There was pretty much no pressure whatsoever in terms of exams. And the entire degree was based on 10 exams in May of my third year. There was no coursework. If you were sick those 2 weeks, it was too bad. You just messed up your degrey. And therefore, the pressure was on for the third year. So I didn't do much work in my first and second year. I did a lot of other things. I was very involved in music. As I mentioned, I was a violinist. I played a lot of orchestras. I actually started an orchestra. I was a conductor of a new orchestra, Oxford Chamber Orchestra, and did a lot of that. It was great. It was amazing. I got very involved in the Hillel, in the Jewish Society, and actually that's a whole other story which is related to this actually, that Oxford was a place that the religiously observant kids who went to Oxford and Cambridge went to Cambridge. That was the known thing. There were far fewer who went to Oxford. Now, I hadn't taken a gap year. I went straight into university. There was nothing that I would have done at a gap year that I wasn't particularly interested in taking a gap year. I certainly wouldn't have gone to yeshiva at that stage, and anything I would have done would probably not have been particularly helpful. So I went straight in. But once they saw another, Jewish kid who wanted to be part of the Jewish group there, they said, okay, we need you for the minyan. We need every person we can. We need certainly every man we can. So I think if I'd have gone to Cambridge, which I never really considered, but I'd have just been left as out of the observant clique, because why did they need me? But I went to Oxford and they really did. So there was no rabbi on campus and there was no chaplain, there was no outreach going on. It was just peer-led connection, and by the end of my first year I was very involved in that group and really found myself basically being, Shabbos observant by the end of the first year in a very sort of organic way, not through a major epiphany, but just I'd always been Orthodox affiliated. I was just now Orthodox affiliated and also halachically more connected. So that became a bigger and bigger interest. So my second year I was also very interested in that. Also still play some music, and by my third year I realized I needed to do some serious work to get to my exams. I also very, very importantly met my wife in the second year at Oxford. It's a 3-year course. Most courses in England are 3-year courses, and she came up a year after me. She'd taken a gap year. She was a lot more observant than I was at the time, we connected, and she was also studying law, although she didn't become a lawyer, and really, she taught me a lot in all sorts of different ways, both Jewishly, and we studied together in law as well. And by my third year I really needed to work hard. I actually needed some decent notes. I didn't have any decent notes. All the lectures were optional. I mean, you can't even believe it. But they genuinely were optional. You didn't have to go to
a dream for many students.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a crammer, if you're a person who can cram it all in at the end, I mean, that's great. If you're not, then it's a disaster. So luckily I was a crammer, and my wife had fantastic notes because she'd worked thoroughly and solidly all the way through and I borrowed her notes, and the least I could do was marry her in response. And I worked actually very hard in my third year, and the more I worked, the more I enjoyed the course. When I was doing other things and sort of dipping into my course, I didn't really enjoy it that much. But then I realized I actually really did. So I actually ended up with a fairly decent degree, certainly decent enough to get a decent job offer. In 1991, when I graduated, there were a lot of jobs on the market. So when I was applying for jobs in my final year of university, so they said, well, as long as you get this degree, you can get a job here, and I did. And then I had a job to go into. There's no LSATs, and there's no going to law school in the same way as in America. There is such a thing as law school in England, but it's not the same as America. It was much more procedural and much more boring and not particularly hard to get into. And it's not like Oxford has a law school. There was one law school for the whole country, basically, and everybody went to that. You had to decide whether you're going to be a solicitor or a barrister. A barrister, the ones with the white wigs, and they're the ones that appear in court. A solicitor is the transactional lawyers, contract lawyers, property lawyers, corporate lawyers, all that kind of stuff, real estate lawyers. I decided I wanted to be a solicitor. Again, I didn't really put much thought into it. No one ever suggested I should be a barrister. There were a lot more solicitors, and therefore I applied to law school to be a solicitor, which is again a transactional lawyer. Law school was 1 year because I did an undergraduate law degree, so I got a lot of exemptions in law school. And after that 1 year, you could then go into a job. Your first 2 years of a job, there was still a certain amount of studying and some exams, etc. You're not completely qualified, but after 2 more years after law school, you were. So effectively, it's 3 years. But the last 2 years were working and earning and just studying a little bit on the side. So I got a job offer in a big firm in London. I'm not from London, but by that time I was engaged, about to be married. We got married immediately that I qualified from law school. Going through law school was not so difficult. It was not such a difficult thing to do. It wasn't like American law school. The hard thing was the degree at Oxford, and then the law school was simple enough. We got married, we moved to London, and I got a job in a big corporate law firm. It wasn't the biggest, but it was a well-paying law firm, and that was one of the things that they prided themselves on as well. But they were also a good, supportive, what they called in those days a medium-sized partnership of about 35, 40 partners, and maybe another 80, 90 lawyers. I joined there. I was 22 years old, nearly 23 at that point, and I just got married, and I started a job as a trainee lawyer, which was a two-year procedure till I qualified.
Okay, so just want to confirm that you did 3 years at Oxford and then another 3 years at law school.
Nearly. I did 3 years at Oxford, another 1 year at law school, and then I started my job, and the first 2 years of my job I was officially a trainee. But I was working and earning and getting experience as well as taking a few exams and doing a bit of this and that.
And then, were you enjoying it at that time? Like you thought, yes, I'm going to be a lawyer, or a solicitor. This is what I want to do with my life.
Yeah, loved it. It was great. I was commuting into the centre of London. Again, I was a provincial kid. It was very new, very exciting, with my little black briefcase that everyone carried in those days. I had about an hour commute, which was pretty normal in London. The job was great. I worked for a really wonderful firm. They were very supportive. It's interesting. When I first met them, I did not wear a kippah. But by the time I was ready to take the job, I did wear a kippah. And I came to them and I said to them, look, even though my goalposts have shifted a little bit, I will now be wearing a kippah at work. Is that okay with you? They said, it's absolutely fine with you. We're fine with us, totally. I was pretty much one of the only Jews in the practice. There was another observant Jew there, and there was a couple of other sort of more assimilated Jewish presences, but it wasn't a Jewish firm in any way whatsoever. But they could not have been more supportive, which was actually not the case for some of my friends who worked for more Jewish firms, but that's a different story. They were very supportive, and they gave me a fantastic training. They had a slightly unusual training system, but basically you get a little bit of everything. You get a bit of real estate law, you get a bit of litigation law, you get a little bit of corporate law, a bit of tax law, and you decide at the end of that 2-year period which department you'd like to go into, and see if they offer you a job in that department. And again, 1993, when I qualified, they were happy to give me a job. I went into real estate law, and that's a little bit of a random thing. The reason I did that is because I knew I did not like litigation, because I'd done a lot of that as a trainee, and I didn't like it. And it was a little bit of a recession on, and there wasn't so much corporate work going on. So I didn't feel particularly experienced at sort of corporate finance and banking and that kind of stuff. So I went into what I knew I could do and what I had done, which was real estate. But again, that was not a choice as much as just a reality that came out of what I'd ended up doing. But I was happy to do that, and it was fine. So I qualified in 93.
Okay, and how long did you practice real estate law?
Okay, so this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. I realized quite early, even when I was at Oxford, that I needed to bring my Jewish education up to be closer to my sort of postgraduate law education. So I went to yeshiva at the end of my third year. I went to Or Sameach, which was great for the summer, for a long summer, and did some really productive work there and really, really enjoyed it. That was fantastic. And after my 2 years training as a lawyer, so I realized that I needed to spend more time in serious yeshiva learning, and that it was only going to get busier. So I don't even remember whose idea this was, if it was my idea or Sarah, my wife's idea. But between us, we came up with this idea that I should take a year off unpaid leave and go to yeshiva.
Okay.
I just qualified. There wasn't so much work. The Britain was just coming slowly out of this early 90s recession. I said to my boss, the senior partner, who was, again, I was very close to, very supportive guy, very different from me on almost every level, as an aristocratic guy with, 3 hyphenated names and very posh fellow. And I said to him, look, you hired me and you obviously want me to work here. But I've not got much to do, and you're paying me quite a lot of money to do not very much. Why don't I take a year out, and you don't have to pay me, and I'll do something else for a year and learn Talmudic law, and then I'll come back in a year. What do you think of that? I remember having the conversation, actually. Maybe it's a bit of a chutz, I don't know if it's a chutzpahdik, but it was a conversation. And he said,
like you're using your negotiating skills.
I mean, it's not much. It's a bit of a no-brainer for them. They're not paying me at all. So he said, fine. He said, it's a little bit unusual. I've never seen it before, but fine, let's do it. And so basically through 1994, basically I was not working. I spent most of that year. My wife sent me off on my own to Israel a little bit. We were married, obviously, a couple of years by then. We didn't have any kids. I spent a couple of months in Israel studying in Hamivtar, actually, in Efrat. And then put together learning. I had a lot of mentors who helped me put together learning in London. Which was, not ideal because there really wasn't a system to do that there. There's no yeshiva there, but they put together a great schedule, and I basically sat and learned a lot from, about March 94 through till the end of 94, and then I went back to work. I don't know if they expected me to go back to work, but I did. I didn't really have any question. I'm not sure what my parents thought of it at the time. They probably weren't too excited about it, but it was fine. My wife had a job; she was working, well, and then I went back in '94. So from '94 through to about 1998, I worked as a property, real estate, corporate lawyer, getting experience. Basically, I ended up more focused on shopping malls, basically developing them, building them, taking beautiful green fields with cows and birds and turning them into massive shopping centres, developing the land, purchasing the land, developing the land, doing the planning. I worked with planners who were more focused on the planning, and then letting off all the leases to all the major companies that were coming in there, then selling off the whole package to some kind of an insurance company or an institution of some kind who buys it. That was the life cycle of things I was doing. I enjoyed it. I got out and about. I went on visits to all over to pick up property, and it was great.
So what changed?
Well, it's interesting what changed. A few things changed. When I was about 28, maybe 28, I was on quite an aggressive career track. I was trying to make a name for myself there. I never worked crazy hours, in fairness. Even though there was a corporate culture of people staying late and and when I needed to, I did. When I needed to, I slept there at night as well when I had to. But that was a rarity. And I used to get home for 6:45, 7 p.m. I had a wife at home, and then we had a couple of kids, and Sarah was working in other places in London. And I got in. I left in the morning from the house about 7:45, 8 o'clock, and I was in for about 8:45, 9. So I didn't work crazy hours, but I did turn around to the company and when I was 28 and said, right, I think you should make me a partner now in the firm. There was one particular other guy that they made a partner who I felt was not the most, impressive guy in the firm. And I said, look, if you made him a partner, you've got to make me a partner. And they sort of said, hummed and hawed, and they said, okay, you're a bit young, but we'll make you a partner. And that's, I think, where it changed. Because, they let me into the inner circle. They paid me a lot of money, honestly, in my late 20s. But then, of course, they'd let me in. So they, on a certain level, owned me. Not in a sort of malicious way, and they were still very supportive, very nice. But I then had to produce, a lot more for the firm because they'd let me into the inner circle, or the outer circle at least, not the inner circle. So that's when I think the timing started to get a lot more. Obviously, more responsibility, and I don't know if now's the time to talk about it, but I always felt there were three factors that I was balancing in my career. One of them was how much I enjoyed it and got job satisfaction. Another was how much I was getting paid. And a third one was how much time it allowed me and sort of headspace to do the rest of the things in life that I wanted to do. I was learning b'chavrusa every night. I had regular learning with people, and we had a couple of kids. So I always figured that if you get 3 out of 3, if you get the job satisfaction and the money and the time to do other things you want to do in life, then that's a winner. I mean, I don't think many people get 3 out of 3. I always felt if you get 2 out of 3, then you're doing okay. So I always got the money because the money was great, and I either really enjoyed it but was very busy, or was not so busy and it was boring. But I always got 2 out of 3.
Okay.
Though there came a point when I was regularly just getting 1 out of 3. And I was kind of monitoring this. I was just getting the money because I was working all hours and really not enjoying it as much, and it was beginning to impact on other things I wanted to do. So that started to change, and then a few other things changed. The one thing that changed is I actually got sick a little bit. I ended up with mono, which was not fun. I got chicken pox when I was in my late 20s, and then I got mono. And most annoyingly, but luckily for me, my doctor's surgery mixed up my notes with somebody else with the same name as me. I mean, in America, I would have sued them. But there was another guy with exactly the same name, and they kept giving me his blood results, not mine.
Wow. How did that affect you?
They kept telling me I was fine, and there's nothing wrong with you, and it's all in your imagination.
Oh, that was terrible.
So I was sort of almost literally crawling on my hands and knees at one point to get on the train. And eventually the doctor's surgery called me up and said, oh, sorry, we just mixed up your notes. You did have mono all along. You must have felt pretty bad. Yeah, thank you. So, but that really coloured my feeling about work a little bit, which was interesting. And then a few other things happened as well, apart from just having to work long hours and not enjoying it as much. Well, actually, go before that, which is a very important point. I was asked in the sort of late 90s, 97, 98, if I would give a class to people in the neighbourhood. We lived in northwest London. And I'd been learning and studying, but I wasn't a rabbi. So I said, well, why would I give you a class? They said, no, we think it'd be fun. My friends, peers, all guys in their late 20s, early 30s. So I asked my Rav. We have a Rav that we'd had since our days in Oxford, Rabbi Alan Kimchi. We're still very close to him. I went to him and I said, look, do you think I should give this class? Why would I do that? And he said, no, it'll be good for you. If you enjoy it, you'll prepare some material, you'll give a class, see how it goes. So I gave this weekly shiur in my house to this group of guys, and it was amazing. They loved it. I loved preparing for it. I was, to some degree fumbling around and trying to put things together. But, I had a decent brain, and really by my late 20s, early 30s, I was realizing there was something else that I really enjoyed doing that I didn't feel as qualified to do, but realized it was something I loved doing. I never thought of being an educator. No one ever suggested it for a second at high school. It didn't come from any of my family. I never even thought of it. I think that was just not considered to be a successful outcome. Then I realized I wanted to do that. So a combination of my work becoming much less enjoyable for various different reasons, one of them health, one of them just work, and me realizing there was something else I very much enjoyed doing, but didn't really know how to do as well as I wanted to, they started to conspire to a realization in my early 30s that I actually was thinking of a change. And then various things, came as catalyst to that. The Intifada broke out in 2000. My wife was working in Jewish, in Israeli hasbara, in trying to put the Israeli position to the British media. She was working with Rabbi Sachs and with others, and for her it was very frustrating because the BBC were not particularly interested in hearing that position, and she was feeling this sense that we should be in Israel more. And I was feeling this sense that I should be learning more. And those two things, really, it's a very good job that they came together, because it could have been quite difficult if they hadn't. But by the early 2000s, we were coming to the view that maybe we should be making a radical shift, both career-wise and also in terms of going to live in Israel, which we never really considered in our early to mid-20s.
Okay, so let's shift a little bit to the decision to become an educator. I guess you probably had to go back to school for that, to become a rabbi.
Right.
How did that decision come about, and did you do that full time, or were you also still working while you were retraining?
Right. So there was a very brief moment when I realized I needed to go back to yeshiva and really learn in a way which was professional. Meaning I had by that time probably a pretty standard background for a lawyer that had been to yeshiva when he was younger. Because I'd been effectively a couple of years, put it all together, but I didn't have enough to do it professionally. I took a lot of advice. Sarah and I took a lot of advice from a lot of mentors. Mostly rabbinic mentors, but across the board, we really sat down with a lot of people that we trusted, and we asked them, does this sound like a sensible move for me to move out of the law and go full time into pretty much requalifying? I didn't really want to be a community rabbi, but I wanted to be an educator. So I didn't know how long exactly that would take, but I knew it would take quite a few years. I couldn't just take another leave of absence from work. That was not going to work. I knew I had to leave and then restart if it happened that way. So most of the advice that we got was very supportive of that. Some of it extremely blunt, that like if I wanted to be a genuine educator, then I couldn't continue to be a fraud educator. One of my mentors actually put this to me very strongly, Rabbi Akiva Tatz. He said to me, right now you're giving a class to your friends and you're only 1 week ahead of everybody else. That's not called being an educator. Basically, he said, you've got to sit down for at least 2 years, solidly. So my wife and I discussed it. We decided to leave my job, and she kept her job going. She'd started a business, was working with a business, starting her own business, so she was doing very well professionally. She went into marketing, advertising, public relations, even though she had a law degree, like I said. So she said, look, I'm working. We'll manage on my wage. It wasn't as big as my wage by a long way, because I was in a Wall Street type legal practice. But we'll manage. We'll rent our house out for 2 years. We'll go to Israel. There was a brief moment where we talked about, like, should we do it in England? But we realized that wouldn't answer what we really wanted. Certainly not for Sarah, and probably not for me either. And we said, okay, we're going to go to Israel. I put together a great opportunity to learn in a very a much higher level yeshiva than I was ready for. That was the advice that I was given, that be a very small fish in a very big pond. So I actually threw myself into a yeshiva in Jerusalem called Ateret Yisrael. It's not in Jerusalem anymore. It was like an offshoot from the Hebron yeshiva system. It was an Israeli yeshiva. It was very intense, and there was a group of Anglo sort of South Africans and English people, not really Americans, who were in that and doing their own thing and then being part of the big yeshiva. So I got connected to that, which was amazing, and we decided to see how that would go. But it was largely a leap of faith. I gave up my job. I figured that after 2 years I'd get another job, which in retrospect was correct. Meaning 2008 was a recession, but this was 2004. No one could work out in advance, but it would have been fine in 2004. I would have gone back into another legal job, maybe not in the same place. And my wife was working. We rented out our house, and our kids were 5 and 7 when we came. There was a window our kids were small, and I felt I could take a small amount of time out, come back, and we'd see how that works. And we decided to go for that 2-year period and reassess after that.
And so then, did you stay or did you go back? How did that turn out for you?
Okay, so the best advice actually we got a lot of great advice. And by the way, some of our rabbinic mentors told me not to go. A few of them said no, be a lawyer, give money to the Jewish community, and we were very much part of the Jewish community. I was the gabbai of the shul, and we had our kids in Jewish day schools, so very small but young, but in Jewish day school. But the 2 years went great, actually. The 2 years went really well. Our family were not at all in favor of it. We can talk about that separately. But the 2 years went very well. The kids settled into school. That was a big question for us. How would they settle into schools? We were very clueless as to how that would work. It was just at that period where you didn't have to go to a Merkaz Klita anymore. So you didn't have to go to this absorption center. So we just landed ourselves in Jerusalem. We chose to live in Har Nof, which was a great choice at the time. And the kids settled very quickly. We ended up with great schools for them, which was again, a big blessing. We didn't necessarily plan it all the way it worked out. And Sarah's job was working well, and my learning went great. And after 2 years, we decided, look, we actually wanted to stay in Israel. We actually wanted to make Aliyah. And our kids would stay in the schools that they were in, and I would work out the next step. But we realized at that stage that we did not want to go back to England. Our family, in retrospect, said, "Oh, we never thought you were going to come back," but we genuinely did think we might come back. The best advice we got was from Rabbi Sachs. He told us, write in an envelope, should we stay or should we, go back? And write on the envelope not to be opened until the second half of our second year. Meaning, don't think all the time, did I do the right thing? Should we go back? What are we going to do? But just park it, be in the moment. That's why they told us not to come for a year, actually, which was good advice. Because a year, as soon as you get settled, you're already thinking of coming back. 2 years was great, and we opened that envelope, as it were, at the end of middle of our second year, and said, "Oh, should we stay or should we go?" And we decided to stay was the best. So we were open to going back, but it was clear to us that we should not go back.
It sounds like you have a lot of mentors and a lot of people who are guiding you, not just in the Aliyah process, but throughout your whole all of your decision-making processes from high school and beyond. So right. I would love to hear a little bit about how much you relied on that and how it was for you to have that support system, because I think a lot of people don't even know that they need it.
Right. So I think when I was younger at high school, I didn't really have much agency in that consultation. People would tell me, like, this is what you should do. And okay, that sounds good. Once we were in our mid to late 20s, I think we had much more involvement in seeking out the people that would, help us probably the most, and weighing up their advice. And taking advice is always a good thing. You just have to know when to accept it, when to ignore it, how to process it. And if you have good mentors, they won't tell you what to do. They will give you their opinion. And it's not like it was a Jewish legal question. We're just asking for an answer. We were asking for life advice. And our mentors were excellent. They gave their opinion. They helped us to weigh the issues. And they said, of course, you need to make up your own mind. So we did. And that, which is how it should be, and we did that, and we did a lot of processing. It was not easy. I mean, now when we look back 23 years later, we wondered, why would we have hesitated? But it didn't look the same from that end. It looked like a scary move, a move of culture, a financially scary move. Growing up as a man in those days, and probably still today, you feel this pressure of being a primary wage earner. And I was, if you like, doing a U-turn on that by giving up a very lucrative job, which would have, in all probability, just led to being an even more lucrative job. meaning my friends, I'm still in touch with some of my friends from law in those days, and some of my clients actually, which is interesting. And most of them did great, and they stayed in the firm, and they retired at 55, my age pretty much now, I'm 56, with just stacks of money. I mean, more money than they can spend in the next 25, 30 years. They just don't know what to do with it. And I would have probably been in that situation as well. I don't know if I'd have had any family life in the 30 years in between, but they did that. So, we took a lot of advice, and we thought about it and processed it, and really tried to make the best decisions we could. And I think my wife davened a lot, and that probably helps a lot as well. But
and it worked out, so there you go.
Yeah, and a lot of things feel very random along the way. For example, after my 2 years in Eretz Yisrael, I didn't really know what the next step would be. I knew I needed to be in some kind of kollel. I was obviously an older guy for that. I was in my mid-30s by then. I was 35, something like that. So where am I going to go? What am I going to do? And just what felt pretty randomly, maybe these things are not so random. We had a guest for a meal on Shabbat, and I saw him revising something. I said, "What's this? What are you doing?" And he was reading a source sheet that he was preparing for a test. And I looked at the source sheet, and I just saw from the layout, from the structure, from the way it was presented. I said, "Look, I don't know where this is from, but I really feel I need to be part of this organization, whoever this is." It really struck me, because it was very organized. There was a flow, there was a beginning, there was a middle, there was an end. And I looked into it, and this was someone called Rabbi Berkowitz. He just set up a kollel in 2004, I think, and I joined in 2005 or something like that. And I was there for 3 years after my 2 years in Eretz Yisrael. So if I hadn't have met this guy with the source sheet, I don't know what I would have. Maybe I would have found it anyway. But I found a real home there. And by the end of those 3 years, so there's 5 years in total. So at that point, I felt a little bit less of a fraud as an educator. That I had a little bit more, caught up a little bit the educational gap, a little bit.
Okay, so what was your first job as an educator like?
Yes, that was an interesting question. I mean, I'd given quite a lot of shiurim by then, both in terms of the ones I gave in London. I even spoke in Shabbos, on Shabbos in London a little bit at my shul, at other shuls. And so I was not new to speaking. And also as a lawyer, you're used to speaking and sounding as though you know what you're talking about. That's the thing. The legal training enables you to be that fraud if you want to be that fraud, because you have to sound confident and you have to sound whatever. But hopefully you can grow out of that and not be the fraud. I didn't really know where I was going to teach, honestly. I ended up that one of my close mentors from the yeshiva I was in Eretz Yisrael, his chavruta's wife was looking for someone to teach in a women's gap year program. Now, I'd never taught women before. I'd never taught in a gap year program before. I didn't really have anything to do with a gap year program ever. And so I went to meet them. I said, "Look, what are you looking for?" And he said, "Look, I'm looking for someone who can teach a halacha course." I said, "Okay, Jewish law." I was a lawyer. I'm sure I could put that together. And I've been learning halacha for 5 years. I had a decent smicha, I had 3 smichas in different places. I said, "What's the topic?" He said, "Look, we have a course on interpersonal, Jewish law. We'd like you to teach that." And I said, "Yeah, that should be no problem." I didn't know anything about interpersonal Jewish law at the time. I said, "But we'll put it together. We'll make it work." And I ended up in a job teaching a bunch of 18-year-olds who came mostly out of American high schools. I didn't really have a lot of experience teaching Americans. It was more of a sort of right of center place, so they were mostly coming out of the Beis Yaakov high school system. But they were great students, and I designed courses which looked a little bit like my Oxford law degree. I designed sort of essay questions with scenarios rather than giving them multiple choice things, which I never related to that. It always felt like a sort of cheat test. If they give you the answers, you just have to pick the one. So I gave them scenarios of like situations and asked them to analyze and what should be the answer here, what should be the answer there. They really enjoyed that, and I enjoyed teaching it, and there was a success. And it turned out they liked the way I taught it, and I enjoyed teaching them, and that began a whole career teaching young women, really, first in gap year post high school programming, and then in the college and university stage, which was the kind of next stage.
What was that? What was the name of that first school that you taught in?
It's not. It doesn't even exist anymore. Its name was Unpaid Torah.
Oh, okay.
Unpaid
It
Torah.
existed in my time.
Right, and it was a nice school. It was nice. The people who ran it were very helpful, very supportive, very friendly. I also got very involved at that stage in Chappelle's and Midrash Rachel V'Chaya, which is for college age and young professional men in the yeshiva, women in the midrashah. We had a strong connection with that even from England. Because when we lived in England, when the Rosh Yeshiva used to come, and Rabbi Karlinsky and others used to come to England to give shiurim, we were one of the people that would put together his programming. We had connections from back then. So it seemed natural that I would connect with that organization. And once I'd been teaching for a bit, I approached them and said, look, would you be interested in me teaching? And they said, yeah, in the women's school, they're looking for some new teachers. Teaching women in Torah subjects is I've always found more interesting for a few reasons. First of all, they need more teachers, because in yeshivas the guys learn with each other for a good part of the day, so you're not teaching them every hour. Secondly, they have much more breadth in what the kind of things that they're teaching, and therefore that a lot of the things that I wanted to teach, they don't need me to teach a Talmud shir in Israel. They've got like millions of people that can do that. So what I can bring to the party is maybe something else. Talk about that maybe soon. So I ended up teaching much more in the midrashah, and have been there consistently since for the last 20 years, and now I'm actually running it, which is a whole next stage, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. But that's what. So by my mid to late 30s, I was basically teaching women both gap year programming and also these sort of college age and young professional women as well.
How did people react, from your professional life and possibly your parents and other family members when you told them you were going to make this change?
It's an interesting question. Let's start with family members. Not positive. Our family were pretty much clearly against the decision. I think my parents must have thought that I'd lost my mind, having sort of helped me and encouraged me to become a successful professional, which is something that no one in my family had ever done before. So why I would give that up to do something crazy like go live in Israel without knowing what I was going to even do there, they must have thought I'd been kidnapped by the some kind of cult. But it's hard to say that, because I was in my early 30s and I had a professional perspective, so it was a bit hard to argue that I suddenly lost my senses. But also it was dangerous in Israel then. I mean, I don't know what's dangerous and what's not dangerous. Maybe it's a lot of psychology. But it was during the Intifada. A lot of buses were blowing up. A lot of people were getting killed. And it was not an easy time to move. It was our time to move. That was our window. And we needed to take that window. Our kids were the right age. Our parents didn't need us in England. I was at the right career stage to do that. But our family were pretty against it. Also, they were concerned they weren't going to see their grandchildren, etc. Which, in the end, they did see plenty of their grandchildren. England is not so far from Israel. We spend a lot of time going back there. They spend a lot of time coming to Israel. My parents now live in Israel.
So how long did it take them to come around?
I mean, coming around to us being successful in Israel, it took them maybe 6 or 7 years, I think, before they really came around to the idea that they could see that it was, even though my salary probably went down by 85-90%, our quality of life went up by the same factor. And even my parents and my in-laws who didn't want us to leave could see that. I once asked one of them if I'd have stayed a lawyer and been earning over $1 million a year probably by that stage, without exaggeration, what do you think? I asked them, what do you think I would have done with that money? And they said, well, we know you'd have probably bought an apartment in Jerusalem and gone there for vacations and that. I said, but I have an apartment in Jerusalem and I'm here the whole year, not just for vacations. So what exactly did I lose along that? I ended up not needing to earn the money and having the vacation apartment the whole year round. So
Brilliant.
So anyway, so they didn't really argue with that. And as I said, eventually my parents themselves came to live in Israel, which was a wonderful, wonderful move for them as well. But they didn't react particularly well at the beginning. My work colleagues were just didn't understand what was going on. This is the kind of corporate craziness, the culture that I was working in. When I took my boss out for lunch to tell her that I was leaving. When I told her that, she says, "Oh goodness, I didn't think that's what you were going to tell me." I said, "Well, what did you think I was going to tell you?" She said, "I thought you were going to tell me that the team has fired the boss and you're the hitman to fire me, to get rid of me, and because there's a takeover by the junior." That's the kind of corporate culture that there is, and that was a good firm. And I said, no, I'm not going to sack you. I'm just going to leave. But I've stayed in touch with many of them, and I found them to this day to be friendly and again, all non-Jewish colleagues, and really good people, strong people.
Okay. What's the most rewarding part of making this change?
I mean, I ended up doing something that I love doing, and I never loved being a lawyer. I enjoyed being a lawyer for most of the time, but I never loved it. I ended up doing something which I feel has a real purpose and a real meaning. And I'm not sure that you need to have a career that has deep purpose. You can have a career which is satisfying and enjoyable and gives you enough money and support to live the life that you want to live. And I think that's an honourable thing. I don't think you have to have a career which has deep intrinsic purpose. But again, if you're more of a Hasidic kind of thing, you can make deep intrinsic purpose out of every part of what you're doing. I wasn't brought up like that, but I understand how you might do that. But I ended up in a career where not only is it enjoyable, but I think it also has enormous purpose. And it's one in which I'm able to learn a lot. And it's given me much more of an intellectual and academic challenge than I would have had being a corporate lawyer. Because believe me, there's very little academic or intellectual challenge. At a certain point, it's just business, basically. It's, doing deals and making money for people who already have money.
Totally fair point. How do you think that this journey that you've taken has impacted the way you mentor your own students?
Look, it's been a big. I dine out a lot on the fact, and I don't push it. They push it that Rabbi Manning was an Oxford lawyer. Somehow or other, to some people, that gives a certain level of credibility. Great. I'm not going to argue with that. I having been to Oxford and seen the people that were there, I'm not sure it's as exciting and highbrow as people think. But nevertheless, it does, I suppose, give me a certain level of credibility in that I don't have to be doing this. I'm doing this because I want to do this, although at this stage I'm not sure I could go back and be a lawyer, quite honestly, even if I wanted to, which I don't. It brings in a certain sort of skill set from elsewhere, which is not a standard skill set for this job. Meaning there are other educators who used to be lawyers. There are some quite well-known rabbis who used to be lawyers. And I think it does give me a certain ability to do what I do in a way that I would never have been able to do it without having been a lawyer. And I'm happy to talk about what that is. And in a way that other people who never had that legal background, they don't do it that way. And they don't know how to do it that way. They do it great and they do it their own way. But they don't do it the way I do it. And that gives me a certain sort of difference in that sense because of my skill set.
It's a good perspective. Do you have advice that you would give your younger self if you could do it over?
I don't know. I'm not sure we would have done it a different way. It evolved the way it evolved. And our journey in Israel was influenced as much by our children as by ourselves, because then our children grew up to be the Israelis and that they are. We're very proud of both of them, and they do amazingly. And we've learnt a lot from them as well. I could never have predicted that. I feel that our lives are a constant evolution in a way that they wouldn't have been in London. I'm not sure that my 32-year-old self would have really understood the way that it works. If I could have sat with him, I don't know what I would have said differently other than, yeah, this sounds like a good move. But so much has changed in that way. And I think I've evolved in different ways. I don't know, it's a counterfactual. Looking back on it, I don't think we would have done it any differently. I don't think we could have done it in a way that would worked out any better, Baruch Hashem. So, I'm pretty pleased with how it worked out. Thank God.
And what would you tell people who are facing the same fears and questions in the evolutionary process?
Right. And yes, and I'm not making out it was an easy choice. It was a very difficult choice.
Change is never easy.
For us, it was a composite choice of a few different things. I wasn't just moving career; we were also moving country. We were, doing something very different. So I don't know what it would have been like becoming a teacher in England. I did, by the way, look a little bit at that, just to make that point. When after I'd been in education here, we went back for sort of a pilot trip, saying how would it work to be in high school education in London. And after a very short time, I realized it would have been an awfully disastrous thing to do and would not have been good on any level, and we quickly dropped that idea. The advice I would give people is to, like we talked about before, to really find the mentors to give advice. Go for a lot of that advice. The broader your input, then I think the better decision making you have, ability you have. And process that. You don't have to do what people tell you. A few people told us things along the way which we thought about, and in terms of our kids' education as well, certain people gave us unsolicited advice to take our children out of this school and put them into that school immediately. And we thought about that, and we realized it was bad advice. They didn't know us, they didn't know the kids, they didn't really know the school, and they were well-meaning people giving very poor advice. And you have to, when you hear advice, you have to know when it's bad advice. Sometimes it's not always clear, but it's not like you're asking a halachic decision where then you have to, I got my decision and now can I ask someone else? It's really not like that. You can spread that question as broadly as you can, and we did, and therefore I would give that advice to people. You can almost not. Oh, what are you worried about? People will give you different answers. Well, no, that's the whole point. They'll give you different perspectives, and you'll think about it better. One of the most frustrating things with students is there are certain students that want to make big decisions, and they don't want to talk to their teachers and mentors about it, and they're scared to have that conversation. In case, I don't know, someone tells them to do something differently. Again, your mentor shouldn't be telling you what to do. They should be giving you perspective. I try to help the student to understand that it's not going to harm them to have those conversations. They don't have to do what I say or what I think, but might be helpful for them to listen to the perspective, not just mine, other people's too. So I think, don't be nervous and scared about that. That's what's going to help.
Yeah, that's good advice. You're probably very popular there.
I don't know. I don't know about that, but it's actually interesting in other areas. I think just being involved in teaching and doing a lot of learning, which is an amazing thing. Also, to be in a career where I feel that I can spend my whole day doing something which is Jewishly mitzvah oriented. It's like which is a great thing. But again, not to put down a career, that is important as well, and that's also a mitzvah on a certain level. But I think it left me in my early 50s feeling that my secular education had now dropped behind, which is interesting. And therefore I ended up, now I'm in a PhD program, I'm doing a doctorate in Jewish philosophy. I'm signed up with YU, and I'm over halfway through it now. It's been fascinating. It's been an opportunity to actually expand my Jewish learning as well, because the way it works there is you do a lot of courses on different topics, and I've picked courses that are going to amplify and deepen my own learning and teaching. And I'm working on thesis ideas. I'm not going to get into that now, but it's been, one side's been pushing up the other in that sense. And also just recently, there's one important point actually on the career thing which I didn't make before, which is that I realize now that I thought I just didn't like being a lawyer, but now I realize I didn't like doing the same thing for more than 9 or 10 years. Because every 9 or 10 years since leaving the law, I have switched into something quite different. And now I think it's just me that just needs to make that change every 10 years in order to stay interested and focused and etc. So I've worked in a few different gap year programs as a director over that last 15 years, and now I've just taken over as the director of Madrasha Rachel, where I mentioned I was teacher before. So I just feel that for me, I don't know if this is for everybody, I've stayed focused and interested by doing something different every so many years. I don't know if 10 is a magic number, 7 is a magic number, but something like that. And not everybody has the opportunity to. I was very pleased to have a very supportive wife, which is a large part of it. But now I realize that about myself.
Yeah, I'll just ask the last question, and that was really going to be, what would you tell people the best way to deal with naysayers or with doubters or family members that are having concerns? What's the best, chizuk or strength that you can give people in that situation? Because I think that's what holds a lot of people back.
Yeah, I see that, and I hear that. Look, one has a big responsibility to family. It's not a small thing, especially to parents. Apart from just the ethical and moral debt of gratitude one owes to parents, one has a very significant halachic and Torah mitzvah obligation to respect and to support one's parents. However, I would say to people that that doesn't mean that you have to do what your parents want you to do. Halachically or ethically or in terms of one's life, one has to think about the right thing to do for one's own development in life and one's children's developments, and to building the broader community and making the biggest contribution that you can make. And for everyone it's a different area and different contribution, but if you feel that there's really something else you should be doing in your life to make that difference to your own family and to the broader community, then you only really have one life to do that. I'm sure if I had 5 lives, one of them would have been spent as a successful corporate lawyer. Why not? That would have been great. But I realized, I think, when you only have one life and you have to try and maximize that. I think a lot of parents obviously mean well for their children, but a lot of parents themselves are very needy of their children. And that's a line that the adult child has to try and recognize. Are my parents really coming to this approach because they actually need me psychologically? They're maybe worried about their ability to support me. It's their own financial anxiety that is driving their inability to support my choice. And all these things are perfectly understandable, but they're not reasons for you to make a life decision because your parents are psychologically needy in that sense, or are worried how they're going to support you 20 years down the line. That shouldn't be a major factor. Again, supporting one's parents financially when they need that and being there for them, respectful, 100%. But I think people who are held back by family, they have to analyze. Is that a reasonable approach, or is the family themselves just not able to let go for their own personal internal psychological anxiety needs? And then that's not a fair reason to make a decision, and it's not always easy to separate those issues. That's why you need a lot of advice from people that understand the importance of family and halachic obligations to family, at the same time as the importance of you realizing your own potential and that for the community as a whole. So I think that people are very nervous these days. People are very anxious. I have students whose parents are tracking them on their phones, and their students are in their mid-20s, and there's no explanation for that other than something unhealthy in the parent, and that needs to be treated and dealt with. But it's not a reason to be holding back the child.